There are moments in a champion's career that never make the highlight reels. Not because they aren't important, but because they happen far away from the cameras. For Novak Djokovic, one of those moments came not on center court, not during a trophy ceremony, and not after another Grand Slam victory. It happened in a quiet interview. A moment so honest, it may have revealed more about his future than any match ever could. Speaking about Carlos Alcaraz and Jannik Sinner, Djokovic admitted something that stunned even longtime tennis fans. He said facing them now feels like playing against himself from 10 and even 15 years ago. And then he added something even more revealing. He said, "It hurts." Think about that for a second. This is Novak Djokovic, a man who has built his career on mental toughness. A player who has survived 5-set classics, career-threatening injuries, and 2 of the greatest rivals the sport has ever seen. Yet the word he chose wasn't challenging. It wasn't difficult. It was hurts. And when someone as measured as Djokovic chooses a word like that, you know it means something deeper than a disappointing result. It suggests a change that's been building quietly for years. Not just in the rankings, not just in the results, but in the balance of power across men's tennis. Because this isn't the story of an aging champion losing to the next generation. It's far more complicated than that. We're talking about a player many consider the greatest in tennis history. A man who outlasted Roger Federer, outlasted Rafael Nadal, and rewrote records that once seemed impossible to touch. Now, for the first time in a very long time, he's standing in the middle of a battle where he's no longer the clear favorite. On one side, Carlos Alcaraz, fearless, explosive. Already a multiple Grand Slam champion while still in the early years of his career. On the other, Jannik Sinner, calm, clinical, relentlessly efficient. The player who defeated Djokovic in straight sets at Wimbledon before going on to lift another major trophy. And caught between these 2 rising forces is Novak Djokovic, still competing, still believing, still refusing to walk away. Yet one statistic tells the story better than any headline ever could. 11 consecutive Grand Slams without lifting the trophy. For almost any other player, that would still be considered an incredible career. For Novak Djokovic, it feels almost unimaginable. So what is really happening? Are we simply witnessing the natural changing of the guard? The same cycle every generation eventually faces? Or is there something much deeper happening beneath the surface? Something psychological, something even Djokovic himself is only now beginning to acknowledge. Because here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Only weeks after making that remarkably honest admission, Djokovic returned with an entirely different message. This time, there was no vulnerability, no reflection, no acceptance. Instead, there was fire. Looking ahead to a possible showdown with Alcaraz and Sinner at the US Open, Djokovic made his intentions crystal clear. He said he wants to kick their ass. So which version of Novak Djokovic should we believe? The man who openly admits these matches now hurt, or the competitor who still believes he can beat both of them when it matters most? Maybe they're both real, and that's exactly what makes this rivalry unlike anything men's tennis has seen in years. Because this isn't simply a story about 3 extraordinary players. It's a battle between generations, a fight between experience, youth, legacy, and ambition. Alcaraz and Sinner have spent the last 2 seasons pushing each other to remarkable new heights, trading titles, trading the world #1 ranking, and establishing what many believe could become the defining rivalry of the next decade. Yet standing in the middle of that rivalry is the greatest champion of the modern era, a man who refuses to surrender his place in history without one final fight. 3 players, 3 different generations, 1 throne, and a power struggle that's becoming far more personal than the rankings can ever reveal. Because by the end of this story, you'll understand why Djokovic's words may matter far more than his recent defeats, and why the next chapter between these 3 men could define the future of men's tennis. To understand why Novak Djokovic made those comments, you have to go back much further than this season, much further than Wimbledon. In fact, you have to go back to the era he referenced himself, the version of Novak Djokovic from 10, even 15 years ago. For nearly 20 years, men's tennis belonged to three names: Roger Federer, Rafael Nadal, and Novak Djokovic. Every Grand Slam, every major final, every historic record seemed to pass through one of them. Fans didn't just watch matches. They watched history unfold. And through all those unforgettable battles, Djokovic achieved something few believed was possible. He didn't simply compete with Federer and Nadal. He outlasted them. He surpassed them in Grand Slam titles. He broke records many thought would never fall. When the greatest era in tennis history finally came to an end, Djokovic was the last man standing. That's why this new chapter feels so different. Because for the first time in years, he's no longer chasing history. He's trying to protect it. And the players challenging him aren't just talented. They're beginning to resemble the very player Djokovic once was: young, fearless, relentless, hungry for every opportunity. It's no coincidence that Djokovic says facing Carlos Alcaraz and Jannik Sinner feels like facing his younger self, because that's exactly what he's seeing across the net. Players with nothing to lose and everything to gain. The shift didn't happen overnight. It happened gradually, one tournament at a time, one rivalry at a time, until it became impossible to ignore. Around 2023, the balance of power began to change. Alcaraz was no longer viewed as a promising teenager. Sinner was no longer considered an emerging talent. They had become legitimate Grand Slam champions and genuine threats to every major title. Since then, Djokovic has suffered a series of painful defeats against one or both of them at Grand Slam tournaments. For a player who once dominated the biggest stages almost effortlessly, those losses carried a significance far beyond the scoreboard. They suggested something the tennis world had been reluctant to admit. The next generation wasn't simply arriving. It had arrived. Then came the 2025 season. And that's when the rivalry between Carlos Alcaraz and Jannik Sinner truly exploded. They weren't just winning tournaments. They were pushing each other to levels rarely seen in modern tennis. By the end of the season, both players had won exactly 24 career titles. An extraordinary coincidence, almost as if the sport itself refused to separate them. Throughout the year, the world #1 ranking changed hands repeatedly. One month, it belonged to Sinner. The next, Alcaraz answered back. Neither player allowed the other to stay on top for long. Every tournament felt like another chapter in an increasingly personal rivalry. By the time the 2026 season arrived, the conversation had changed completely. This was no longer about potential. It was about dominance. Who would become the face of men's tennis for the next decade? And more importantly, could Novak Djokovic still stop either of them? Then Wimbledon arrived. And with it, an entirely new layer to the story. Carlos Alcaraz entered the tournament carrying a question mark. A lingering wrist problem. Not serious enough to keep him off the court, but significant enough to affect preparation. In elite tennis, small physical limitations often create enormous consequences. A slightly weaker wrist can change timing, confidence, shot selection, even the willingness to attack under pressure. It's the kind of detail casual fans rarely notice. But players think about every single point. Meanwhile, Jannik Sinner arrived looking almost untouchable, confident, relaxed, playing the best grass-court tennis of his career. Every match reinforced the growing belief that he had become the player everyone else needed to beat. And then came the semifinal. Standing across the net was Novak Djokovic. But this wasn't the Djokovic of 5 or 10 years ago. To reach that semifinal, he had already survived one of the toughest matches of the tournament, a marathon lasting more than 5 hours. The kind of battle that tests every part of a player's body. Afterward, Djokovic admitted something unusually personal. He explained that recovering from those kinds of matches simply isn't the same anymore. After 2 decades on tour, his body no longer responds the way it once did. It wasn't an excuse. It was an honest assessment, perhaps one of the most honest we've ever heard from him. Because even the greatest athlete eventually reaches a point where experience can no longer completely overcome physical reality. Against Sinner, that reality became impossible to ignore. Sinner won in straight sets, controlled the tempo, stayed composed under pressure, and continued his march toward another Wimbledon title. For Djokovic, the defeat carried an uncomfortable milestone: 11 consecutive Grand Slam tournaments, without winning one. For almost any player in history, reaching the semifinals at 39 years old would be celebrated as extraordinary. For Novak Djokovic, it became another reminder of how dramatically expectations change when you've spent your career redefining greatness. But beneath the statistics, beneath the rankings, and beneath the headlines, a much more fascinating battle was beginning to emerge. Because what happened on the court was only part of the story. The far bigger battle was taking place inside Djokovic's own mind. So what is Novak Djokovic really trying to tell us? At first glance, his comments sound like something every aging champion eventually says. The younger players are faster, stronger, more explosive. That's simply how sport works. But if you listen carefully, that's not what Djokovic was talking about. He wasn't complaining about speed. He wasn't making excuses about age. He was describing something far more unsettling. He said facing Carlos Alcaraz and Jannik Sinner feels like facing his own younger self. And that changes everything. Think back to Novak Djokovic in his 20s. Every match was played with relentless intensity. Every rally felt like a battle of endurance. He chased balls most players would never even attempt to reach. He absorbed pressure, countered with precision, and slowly broke his opponents, not just physically, but mentally. That's exactly what made him so difficult to beat. Now, when he looks across the net, he sees 2 players doing those very same things to him. Carlos Alcaraz brings relentless energy. He attacks without hesitation, turns defense into offense in a matter of seconds. Even impossible points somehow become opportunities. Then there's Jannik Sinner. If Alcaraz is controlled chaos, Sinner is controlled perfection. His movement is economical. His shot selection is disciplined. His emotions rarely change. He doesn't overwhelm opponents with theatrics. He overwhelms them with relentless consistency. Different styles, the same result. They force Djokovic into longer rallies, more physical exchanges, and increasingly difficult decisions. But here's what many fans overlook. Djokovic isn't losing because he suddenly forgot how to play tennis. His anticipation is still world-class. His return of serve remains one of the greatest weapons the sport has ever seen. His tactical intelligence is still extraordinary. The difference is much smaller and much more difficult to overcome. Recovery. At 25, a 5-hour match was a challenge. At 39, it's a calculation. Every extra rally matters. Every recovery day matters. Every minor physical issue matters. That's exactly what Djokovic admitted after Wimbledon. His body simply doesn't recover the way it once did. And perhaps for the first time in his career, he's openly acknowledging that reality. What's remarkable is that even with those limitations, he's still reaching the final stages of Grand Slams. That alone says something extraordinary about his level. Because while many former champions struggled just to stay competitive, Djokovic continues to challenge the very best players in the world. That speaks volumes about his professionalism, his preparation, his discipline, and perhaps most importantly, his mindset. But mindset has limits. Eventually, every champion reaches the point where determination alone can't erase biology. And that's where this story becomes fascinating. Because Djokovic knows exactly what's happening, he's intelligent enough to recognize it, honest enough to admit it, yet competitive enough to reject it. That's a contradiction almost every legendary athlete eventually faces. accept reality while refusing to surrender. We've seen this before. When critics questioned whether he could return after injury, he answered by winning majors. When people said the next generation had arrived, he responded by beating them on the biggest stages. Time and again, Djokovic has built his career on proving people wrong. So why should this moment feel any different? Because this time, the challenge isn't one opponent, it's two. And they're pushing each other to become even better. Carlos Alcaraz isn't trying to catch Djokovic anymore. He's trying to stay ahead of Jannik Sinner. Sinner isn't measuring himself against history. He's measuring himself against Alcaraz. Every tournament, every ranking update, every final. They're forcing each other to improve, and that creates a level of competition unlike anything one player can generate alone. Ironically, Djokovic understands this dynamic better than anyone. For nearly 2 decades, his greatest improvements came because Roger Federer and Rafael Nadal forced him to evolve. Without Federer, would Djokovic have developed such an aggressive return game? Without Nadal, would he have reached the same physical and mental standards? Probably not. Great rivalries don't just produce champions. They create better versions of them. Now history is repeating itself. Only this time, Djokovic isn't leading the rivalry. He's trying to interrupt it. There's another layer to this story that deserves attention. Pressure. Most fans assume all the pressure belongs to Djokovic because of his age. But that's only part of the picture. Alcaraz carries the expectations of being tennis's most exciting superstar. Every tournament brings new comparisons, new headlines, new predictions. Sinner faces a different challenge, maintaining the consistency expected of a world number one, defending titles, protecting ranking points, proving his success isn't temporary. Neither player is competing in comfort. They're carrying enormous expectations of their own, which makes Djokovic even more dangerous. Because unlike them, he has already lived through that pressure. He knows exactly what it feels like. And experience remains one advantage that statistics can't fully measure. So perhaps the biggest mistake anyone could make is believing this rivalry is already decided. History tells us legends rarely disappear quietly. But history also tells us every era eventually belongs to someone new. The only question is, has that moment already arrived? Or is Novak Djokovic preparing one final answer the tennis world isn't expecting? So where does all of this leave men's tennis? And perhaps more importantly, where does it leave Novak Djokovic? Because after Wimbledon, the conversation changed. It was no longer just about another Grand Slam defeat. It became a question about the future. Not just his future, but the future of the entire sport. Only weeks after admitting that facing Alcaraz and Sinner hurts, Djokovic delivered a completely different message. This time, there was no reflection, no vulnerability, no acceptance. Looking ahead to the US Open, he made his intentions perfectly clear. He said he wants to kick their ass. It's exactly the kind of statement fans have come to expect from Novak Djokovic. Confident, defiant, unapologetically competitive. Because if there's one thing we've learned over the past 2 decades, it's never to mistake honesty for surrender. But this is where the story becomes more complicated. Words can fuel confidence. They can inspire belief. They can even intimidate opponents. But words alone cannot change physical reality. Djokovic himself admitted that his recovery isn't what it once was. After 20 years at the highest level, his body simply needs more time, more recovery, more management. That's not weakness. It's the unavoidable cost of one of the longest and most successful careers the sport has ever seen. That creates an interesting dilemma. Mentally, Djokovic still believes he can beat anyone. Physically, every tournament asks a bigger question than the last. Can his body keep up with his ambition? Because at this stage of his career, winning 7 best-of-5 matches isn't only about playing brilliant tennis. It's about surviving 2 demanding weeks against the fastest players in the world. That's a challenge even the greatest champions eventually face. Now let's look at Carlos Alcaraz. His situation is very different. The biggest concern isn't confidence. It's health. Reports surrounding Wimbledon suggested that his wrist was still recovering. That matters more than many people realize. The wrist controls timing, touch, acceleration, even confidence on aggressive forehands. When you're known for explosive shot-making, a small physical limitation can completely change how you approach the biggest points. Fortunately for Alcaraz, the U.S. hard-court swing gives him valuable time to continue building rhythm. If he's fully healthy, he's capable of beating anyone. But if that wrist remains even slightly below 100%, every difficult match becomes more complicated. Then there's Jannik Sinner. Ironically, he's entering this period with the fewest questions surrounding him. No major injury concerns. No public self-doubt. No dramatic headlines. Just results. That's become one of Sinner's greatest strengths. He lets his tennis do the talking. His consistency has transformed him from a talented prospect into the player everyone else must now chase. Every tournament reinforces the same message. Beat Sinner, or someone else probably won't. But success creates pressure of its own. The higher you climb, the harder it becomes to stay there. Now every opponent plays with extra motivation. Every title defense carries greater expectations. Every Grand Slam begins with one question: can he do it again? That's a very different kind of pressure. And it's one every world number one eventually has to learn how to manage. Now zoom out. Because this story isn't only about these three men. There's another battle quietly unfolding behind them. The next wave. Players like Lorenzo Musetti, Jack Draper, Arthur Fils, and several others. They're improving every season, learning from every defeat. Closing the gap, perhaps not quite ready to dominate, but certainly ready to take advantage if opportunities appear. That's how every generation enters the conversation, not by replacing legends overnight, but by waiting for the smallest opening. And here's what makes this moment so fascinating. While Djokovic is fighting to extend his legacy, while Sinner and Alcaraz are fighting each other for the future, those younger players are watching all of it. Learning, waiting, preparing. History tells us that tennis rarely stands still. Every era believes it will last forever. Eventually, another one begins. That's why the next few months feel so significant. The US Open isn't simply another Grand Slam. It's another chapter in a much bigger story. Can Djokovic prove there is still one more miracle left? Can Alcaraz return at full strength and reclaim momentum? Can Sinner continue proving that his rise isn't temporary, but the beginning of a new era? The answers won't come from interviews, or predictions, or headlines. They'll come on the court, point by point, match by match, with every rally carrying a little more weight than the one before. And perhaps that's why Djokovic's comments resonated so deeply. Because beneath all the confidence, all the trophies, and all the records, he reminded us of something surprisingly human. Even the greatest champions eventually find themselves staring across the net at the player they used to be. So let's go back to where this story began. Not on center court, not inside a packed stadium, not with a championship trophy, but in a quiet interview, where Novak Djokovic said something that may have revealed more than he intended. He admitted that facing Carlos Alcaraz and Jannik Sinner feels like facing the version of himself from 10, even 15 years ago. That wasn't just another post-match quote. It wasn't an excuse, and it certainly wasn't surrender. It was something much rarer, a champion recognizing the cycle of greatness. Because years ago, Djokovic was the young challenger chasing history. He was the fearless player forcing Roger Federer and Rafael Nadal to confront a future they never wanted to accept. Now, history has turned the page, and Djokovic finds himself standing exactly where his greatest rivals once stood. Looking across the net, at players who remind him of the man he used to be. But here's what makes this story so compelling. Only weeks after making that deeply personal admission, Djokovic reminded everyone why he's one of the greatest competitors the sport has ever known. He didn't talk about retirement. He didn't lower expectations. He didn't accept defeat. Instead, he looked ahead to the US Open and delivered a message that sounded unmistakably like the Novak Djokovic tennis has known for nearly 2 decades. I want to kick their ass. That single sentence tells you everything you need to know. The body may be changing. The competition may be stronger than ever. But the mindset, the belief, the refusal to surrender remains exactly the same. Still, belief alone doesn't decide championships. The numbers tell their own story. 11 consecutive Grand Slams without lifting the trophy. More physical recovery between matches. Longer battles against younger opponents. Those aren't opinions. They're realities. And even Djokovic has acknowledged them. That's what makes the months ahead so fascinating. Because this isn't simply about whether Novak Djokovic can win another Grand Slam. It's about whether experience can still overcome youth. Whether intelligence can still overcome speed. Whether resilience can still overcome time itself. Meanwhile, Carlos Alcaraz and Jannik Sinner continue writing a rivalry that already feels destined to define the next decade of men's tennis. 2 extraordinary talents. 2 completely different personalities. 1 shared ambition. To become the undisputed leader of this new era. Every tournament, every final, every ranking update brings them one step closer to building a rivalry that could someday be remembered alongside Federer versus Nadal, Nadal versus Djokovic, or Federer versus Djokovic. But that future isn't guaranteed. Because one man continues to stand between them, a champion who refuses to let history move on without one final fight. And let's not forget something equally important. While the spotlight remains fixed on these 3 superstars, another generation is quietly getting closer. Every season, players like Musetti, Draper, Fields, and others gain more experience, more confidence, more belief. History has shown us that tennis never waits for permission to begin a new chapter. It simply does. Which means this story isn't really about one rivalry. It's about an entire generation fighting to shape the future of the sport. Maybe Djokovic wins one more Grand Slam and reminds the world why champions should never be counted out. Maybe Alcaraz returns to full strength and reclaims the throne. Maybe Sinner continues his remarkable rise and begins an era of dominance. Right now, every possibility is still alive. And that's exactly what makes this moment in tennis so special. We're not looking back on history. We're watching it unfold, point by point. Match by match, tournament by tournament. One day, fans will remember the trophies, the records, the Grand Slam victories. But they may also remember something much quieter. A simple sentence spoken by Novak Djokovic in an interview. A sentence that captured the moment one of the greatest champions of all time realized the next generation wasn't just arriving, it had arrived. And yet, he still wasn't ready to step aside. Maybe that's the true legacy of great champions. Not that they always win, but that they keep believing they can, long after everyone else has stopped believing for them. So now the question belongs to you. When the US Open begins, who do you believe will leave New York with the biggest statement? Will Novak Djokovic remind the world that greatness never fades quietly? Will Carlos Alcaraz prove he's fully back and ready to reclaim the spotlight? Or will Jannik Sinner take another step toward defining an entirely new era of men's tennis? Share your prediction in the comments below. Because one thing is certain, the next chapter of this rivalry is only just beginning.